Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our 2021 Masters Annual Showcase of Student Research from the MA in Arts Management. And it's part of the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences for Northern Ireland 2021. And the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences is a special event held every year to highlight and promote the role that social sciences in all its forms play in kind of wider kind of social and economic activity, to help us understand how the social sciences help us understand culture, and to bring some of the research that happens behind the scenes within universities out to a wider public. So my name's Ali Fitzgibbon. I'm the subject lead for Arts Management and Cultural Policy here at Queen's in Belfast, and I head up our master's program in arts management. So today's event is very focused on contemporary arts and cultural industries management, and we're going to see a range of presentations from some of our outgoing master's students who have just completed their master's in arts management in 2021. And I'm sure we would agree that anybody who's been doing any form of further education, and particularly postgraduate education, in the middle of a global pandemic has already climbed a mountain that merits, major plaudits and awards, but these students have also performed fantastically. So today we are going to look at the work of three of our students. I'm going to say a little bit more of them in a moment, but just to give you some general housekeeping, we have this set up as a webinar, which means that those attending can't be heard. But if you have questions or comments throughout today, you can put them into the Q&A section, which you can locate on the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. When you move your mouse, you'll get a kind of menu will appear, and the Q&A function is there. You can also, if you are having any technical issues, you can flag those using the chat function, which you can find from the same area. Anybody who received the link for today, if you have problems, you can exit and rejoin. When you rejoin, you may end up in the waiting room briefly. We had hoped to have this event sign interpreted, and apologies that due to circumstances beyond our control, we haven't been able to facilitate that. If you require assistance, you can use the closed captioning function. Individual attendees should switch that on by going to the same menu. And if you look at the bottom, you can see live transcript with two little CCs in the bottom of your screen, just beside the leave button. If you switch those on, closed captioning will appear immediately, and it's reasonably accurate on Zoom. So to move on to the content of our day today, we are looking at influences on contemporary arts and cultural industries management. And this is a really quite a broad topic. What do we mean by influences? And when we talk about those, we mean the forces that are within and without the arts and cultural industries. So inside the individual organizations and beyond the organizations to the wider world, that directly and indirectly prompt and shape the actions and behaviors that people make in arts and cultural work. And without doubt, in 2020 and 2021, we have seen that some of the greatest influences have been concerns of uncertainty and change, both positive and negative. We've seen the acts of things like the Black Lives Matter movement resurging to prompt change, to make us question things. And we've also seen more negative results, such as the outworkings of COP26, where the time for real change has not taken place. So the dissertations presented today represent just some of the influences that we are looking at. Students this year have worked on a wide range of topics, and it so happens that all three of our students today are presenting on topics related to the museum sector. But this is a Master's in Arts Management. And so we have had students who've been looking at intangible cultural heritage, such as Tibetan Thankas art. We've had students exploring the implications of cultural policies in cities on street dance. We've had students looking at gender gaps in contemporary dance and ballet, and the problems of parenthood in contemporary dance. And all of these things have come together to form a wide range of research of new and emerging voices in the landscape, not just of research, but also of the practice of running arts and cultural organizations and producing and creating artistic and cultural projects. So these different dissertations today represent some of the attention that's been drawn by our students to what happens on the inside of cultural institutions and organizations, and also the forces that shape their behaviors from the outside. We have today 3 students, Megan Kelly, Anya Wills and Nan Wang joining us. And we're going to initially go into a video recording of each presentation. Each student has been given 3 minutes, a brief of 3 minutes to produce a summary of their dissertation. And after that, I will rejoin you to introduce our guest speakers today, Raphaela Henze and Federico Escribal, who are joining us to talk more on the kind of global context of arts and cultural industries management. So my wonderful assistant is going to cue up the videos now. Enjoy the show.
My project investigated the relationship Ireland's position as a post-colonial state has in its National Museum by focusing on its repatriation policy. The National Museum of Ireland was established as the Irish outpost of the British Museum when Ireland was still a part of the British Empire. Thus, much of its original collections were comprised of objects acquired as a part of British imperialism. In many ways, the legacies of imperialism are built into the very foundations of the institution. Coupled with the strange place Ireland fills in post-colonialism discourse, the National Museum of Ireland makes for a very interesting case study. There are numerous reasons why this topic is particularly relevant at this time. The last year has been monumental in a number of ways. However, the reignition of the Black Lives Matter movement and the subsequent rise of the decolonisation and repatriation movement in popular media during summer 2020 can be remembered as one of the most defining moments. This led to responses from national heritage institutions across Europe. However, it did not appear as though the National Museum of Ireland responded in similar ways. To do this, I decided to carry out qualitative research, the primary research method being interviews. The original plan was to compare the policy of the National Museum of Ireland to that of the British Museum. However, issues of access meant that that was not possible. So the focus of the project shifted slightly towards comparing similar institutions on the island of Ireland, and the National Museum of Northern Ireland was chosen as a replacement. The interviews were carried out with members of staff of the National Museum of Ireland, the National Museum of Northern Ireland, academics and activists. 6 interviews in total. I then used secondary policy research to flesh out and support the findings. While I originally set out to examine the repatriation policy of the National Museum of Ireland, I instead discovered that there isn't one. In fact, there is simply too much work that needs to be done on the decolonisation of the institution prior to an effective repatriation policy being able to be put in place. There is a number of reasons for this. There is still an over-reliance within the institution to base their policies and practices on that of the British Museum and the United Kingdom in general, a sort of internal colonisation. Furthermore, there is a need for more open dialogue between all parties with stakes in the movement, from activists to museum heads to government officials. The issue of decolonisation is not just a museum one. There is changes that need to happen at all levels of Irish society. Ireland as a whole has changed rapidly since its establishment as an independent country. However, it has been slow to change and work on its remaining colonial structures. Thus, there is a struggle for it to recognise its new multicultural identity. This has left many groups feeling underrepresented on a national level. I found that there is a willingness within the National Museum of Ireland to change. However, it is not something that can happen overnight. One of the biggest issues standing in the way is the lack of knowledge regarding the right steps to take. However, a willingness to change and acknowledging the issues at hand are a very good place to start. Thank you very much.
My research sought to investigate the use and effect of potential buzzwords in the Northern Ireland museum sector. This research understood buzzwords defined in 2 ways. One is a term which describes a new process but with ambiguous terminology, and a term that is not usually used or lacking a common definition in the field. Investigating the use of buzzwords in policy is important because it affects how policy is interpreted and acted upon by museum management, which in turn affects their relationship with the public and impact on society. The meaning of terms are created through power relations in the museum sector. And these meanings can shift between institutions. Despite being vague, can often be granted a common sense meaning by power structures in both policy and institutions. The cultural policies introduced by New Labour in the 2000s placed greater emphasis on how museums solved issues and drivers to improve social inclusion and cohesion, well-being, which inevitably informed museum practice, both adopted and resisted by museum professionals. Northern Ireland museum policy followed the shift, which was of significance given its position as a post-conflict society. However, the impact of language and policy has not been as studied here as extensively compared to the rest of the UK. And here, the intersection between language and policy is much more pronounced. Museums are positioned to solve issues of reconciliation, so terms such as community inclusion have risen in use, yet despite being used, they are often vague and shift meaning. So I used a qualitative multi-method approach, which included interviews with museum professionals and policy and strategy analysis. The analytical approach combined a critical discourse analysis and Kyle Backey's What's the Problem approach. The research found that community inclusion and policy are dynamic and flexible in meaning. However, these meanings were influenced by discourses of power, instrumentalism, reconciliation, and well-being, which was reflected in interview. However, aspects of power made potential buzzwords of community and inclusion contestable, as each term varied in meaning according to museum department or type. This variation was subordinate to policy, and policy interpretations defaulted to two main groups, simplistically Protestant and Catholic. Those who did not fit into these categorizations or with the values of the museum were excluded in the name of inclusion. Museum professionals, however, often shared a desire to move away from this binary grouping. Nevertheless, these interpretations were controlled by underlying power relations within the museum sector, and despite resistance, museums were expected to adopt these terms to communicate their usefulness and value to stakeholders. Museums and museum management therefore deployed this language to further their own goals. In conclusion, this research found the terms community and inclusion to be ambiguous in meaning and deployment. Despite being buzzwords, in some instances, their use was important for communication with stakeholders. However, these terms also carried common sense meanings, which are determined by policy, reinforcing how communities were categorized as needing intervention through a justification of reconciliation and well-being. In turn, reduce the agency of communities to decide if they need such intervention, which increased the exclusion of groups, despite seeking to support museums as a net positive force for inclusion. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Nan, and I'm going to talk about a comparative research study I completed on the role that art museums played in urban regeneration process in two socio-political contexts, Spain and China. I found that there is a lack of research about art museums' role in urban regeneration process in China, and even this was known about the differences between China and similar ventures in Western countries. This was the purpose of my project. I chose the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao and the Power Station out of Shanghai for three reasons. First, they were both industrial heritage sites before they were transformed into art museums. Second, they form part of urban development plans, which aimed to regenerate each city. Third, both of them were the first contemporary art museums in their locale. I employed a quantitative comparative research methodology. I rely pretty simply on policy analysis to conduct this research. I also collected and analyzed some secondary data to enrich my research. There are three key findings that are very interesting. Firstly, both museums were part of an urban development policy, but each was expected to achieve different objectives. The Guggenheim was a flagship project which aimed to reverse the economic decline in Bilbao. The Power Station art was not a flagship project, but was a part of a series of cultural regeneration projects in the regeneration of the World Expo site. This in turn aimed to support other objectives. Secondly, the operational forms of them represent two different cultural policy models. The Guggenheim was a result of cooperation between public and private sector because of the participation of the Guggenheim Foundation. The Power Station art was fully centralized, controlled by an official department led by the Chinese Communist Party, representing the national desire to control art and culture, which can be referred to the engineer model of cultural policy. Certainly, each makes a different contribution to regenerate the city and urban cultural life. From the economic perspective, the Guggenheim made a great contribution to reverse the economic decline of Bilbao. However, Power Station Arts impact was limited. As for promoting arts participation, both made contributions but encountered different problems. The Guggenheim was criticized for its elitist attitude. Some artworks like Jenny Hauser's installation Untitled had not considered that 6.5% of the population over 10 years old were illiterate. The Power Station art experienced a censorship mechanism in the selection of artworks. For example, in the 15 years Chinese Contemporary Art Award, artworks made by Ai Weiwei were removed, even though he was a founding three-time jurist for these awards. Well, in conclusion, much can be learned from comparative studies like this. The significant role of governments and the importance of the objectives of such projects are highlighted. Examining these helps us better to consider the role art museums play in urban regeneration. Additionally, it suggests further research is needed to understand how China's official arts policy systems affect the operation of art museums in China. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much to Nan and Anya and to Megan for those three presentations. They've been working on them kind of over a number of weeks, and I'm really impressed at how they've been able to kind of condense such big meaty topics down to a short 3 minutes. If I could give them like virtual rounds of applause, I would. But the upside of these online encounters is that anybody can join from anywhere in the world. And the downside is that we don't get to kind of stand in person and celebrate, but the virtual celebration is there. This gives you kind of a flavor of some of the topics and the concerns of the students on a master's program in arts management. They do not immediately suggest an arts focus, but when you dig more deeply, you can see that there are these broad, deep ideas of what the purpose of arts and cultural institutions is and how their behavior shapes our social concerns. And this kind of frames for me some of the reasons why we also took advantage of this virtual forum to invite our guest speakers, Federico Escribal and Raphaela Henze. And just if I could take a few minutes to introduce them. I first came across Raphaela Henze's work through an initiative that was set up between Raphaela and my former colleague here, Dr. Victoria Durer. So before I joined Queen's University, the two were involved in putting together a project known as Brokering Intercultural Exchange. And this was born out of common interests to look at how ideas of interculturalism, of global connections, shaped the arts and cultural management practices and behaviors. And I was very taken with this. I was very moved by the motives and the intentions of it, but also by the significance and its importance, not just from a research perspective in terms of what we study in universities and what we teach students, but also to think about it more widely as a social and ethical concern within the global industries that we all study and celebrate. So this idea of kind of recognizing the importance of thinking about a much wider and deeper world and understanding how to kind of create relationships across borders, across languages and across boundaries was, it moved me profoundly. So I'm really delighted that we've been able to kind of bring Raphaela and Federico together, and Raphaela's initial work on international arts management is required reading as far as I'm concerned for any student of arts management. But I'm really delighted that more recently their publication together, and Federico, I have to say this is my first time meeting him, but I'm really delighted having looked at the kind of the text that they've produced, Cultural Management in Latin America. There is such a broad, rich new set of learning to come from this, and I'm delighted they're going to be able to speak. So just to give you some idea of their background, Raphaela Henze is Professor of Arts Management at Heilbronn University. So before she joined Heilbronn in 2010, she worked in a range of different senior management positions in universities, different ministries and foundations. And her focus is on kind of globalization, internationalization and cultural management education specifically. Her initial background is in law, and she has an MBA also from the University of London. And Federico Luis Escribal is a cultural manager who specializes in cultural policies, diversity and cultural rights, and is based at the National University of the Arts in Argentina. And he has been a guest teacher at the Arts Faculty of the National University of Colombia. He directed an arts and crafts school in Sao Tome and Principe in Africa, and served as the head of the National Directorate for Cultural Rights and Diversity Promotion, and as head of the local vocational training system in Buenos Aires City. So I'm going to pass over to them to talk a little bit about the book that they have edited and created together. And then at the end of this session, we will have a Q&A where we'll ask our students to rejoin the session. And anybody who has questions for our two guest speakers or for any of our students, please put your questions into the Q&A function. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for this amazing introduction. I don't know about you, Federico, but I'm really excited now because Ali sets a benchmark so extremely high for the two of us. Yeah, we are absolutely happy and delighted to be part of that. And when I talk about benchmarks, the three presentations before us were amazing. So Federico and I will try our best to live up to that standard. And I have to say, I have been to Belfast a couple of years ago, and I met Ali there in person for the first time in the frame of the Brokering Intercultural Exchange Network. And I have to say, I had a bit of interaction with the master students at that time, and it's an amazing program run at Queen's, apart from this being an enormously beautiful campus and an interesting place to be in the first place. So I'm very happy to be back in Belfast, even if it's only virtually. Yeah, Federico and I, we have been invited to talk about our current research, which is on cultural management and policy in Latin America. And yeah, Federico and I think that this is important, otherwise we would not have embarked on this kind of journey and project, because we have the strong sentiment that voices from Latin America, voices from South Central America are rarely present in our current discourses. So I rarely come across colleagues from the region in international conferences, but also if you as students take a second to reflect on your literature lists, for example, on the reading you have done during the last couple of years, I assume there will be very few authors from that region featuring on that list. And this is something that intrigued me. I think you might have come across, or I hope you come across Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I think is an essential read for everybody in the field. You might have come across Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. It's all these relatively dated works that I came across and that sparked my interest, to learn more from colleagues in the region and hear more of them. And this is why, Federico and I embarked on doing this journey and getting an edited volume out there, which I'm going to show to you in a minute when I'm sharing my screen. So hold on. I hope this works. Okay. I think you are able to see it, right? Any nodding? Yeah, I guess so.
We are.
Okay, awesome. So let's see whether we can also move it. So this led us to this edited volume, which is to a certain extent shameless self-promotion at this point. But what is important to us is that all those that contributed to this project are from within the region, because you have literature on Latin America, but it's mainly, I'm not saying exclusively, but it's mainly written by colleagues from the so-called West. And it's mainly on neoliberal development approaches concerning Latin America. And what we were looking for were authentic voices. And this idea of going south and learning about new narratives is not new. It's not that we invented that. So you've come across Halls, Bieber, De Souza Santos, Membe, October. They've all argued for doing this. And there's a recent article by Schoom from 2019, who also argues from, reflecting on cultural management from the South. But to us, it was important to have these voices, these what we came to call hidden voices gathered within this volume. And why is that important? Because we are both deeply convinced that challenges we are currently facing are global challenges, like just to give you this example of climate change. I'm personally convinced that this cannot be solved within, for example, Europe alone, right? So we need this exchange, we need to learn, we need experience narratives from other parts of the world in order not to reinvent the wheel. And there might be narratives, there might be concepts that are of interest to us. And we will talk about that in a bit. And Federico will dive into that a little more in the second part of that presentation, because we've shared that amongst us. So when I started this project a couple of years ago, I had, and this is typical for research, I had a couple of questions. And after the research, I had even more questions. I think that's what research is mainly about. So what was I specifically interested in when I was thinking about, well, I want to learn about Latin America. So I was interested in learning how cultural management is exercised in geographically diverse and heterogeneous countries like Brazil, Bolivia, Mexico, with a multiplicity of ethnic groups and Afro-descendant populations. I was specifically interested also in the entire issue of nationalism, which we'll see particularly in countries like Venezuela, Chile, Brazil, and in the topic of populism. This is something that I have tried to get my head around for quite a while and published some articles on, because this is what we've seen recently in Europe, in continental Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also in Germany, the swing to the right. Well, we've seen Brexit, we've seen America first, make America great again, save America and North America. So there is this rise of nationalism, populism, and our colleagues in Latin America have ample experience with that for decades already. So I would like to share these experiences. Then the entire topic of colonial legacy, post-colonialism mentioned in your presentations as well. And already the term Latin America, which we use for lack of an alternative, hints at this challenge of a colonial legacy. It is a term that is rarely used within the region, because as you can imagine, this Latin was imposed on the region by the French. So there is this colonial legacy within our language already, and I will have one or two other examples during the presentation popping up as well. And then I have that question on whether cultural management approaches, Western cultural management approaches, are of any use within the region. This is something that is of interest to me as an educator, because I find myself more often in classrooms with an international student body, and I'm wondering whether my background, what I can bring to the table, what I teach, is of any use in different contexts, or whether and how can it be translated, transferred, moderated into other contexts. And then finally, that's what I've stressed already, is this search for new epistemologies, narratives, literature. And one concept that we might talk about a bit more in detail, which became a kind of buzzword, somebody mentioned buzzwords in her presentation before, is this buen vivir, which is a concept which can be very oversimplified, be translated as living in harmony and peace with nature, which is an indigenous concept, which is very, very complex and often maybe misunderstood even in our context. So having said all this, thinking cultural management from the South, as you see here, I have definitely not been the first one to do that, but I learned a lot doing this. And this is something that I would like to share with you, because change begins with me. And particularly when we are in these processes where I have been the only outsider to the region, my Spanish is very limited, close to non-existent, so to say. And we can talk about language for quite a while. And COVID not allowing me to even go to that region, I learned a lot about myself within this entire project. I hadn't had a huge network in Latin America, because there are no academic networks like, for example, Anchored in Europe or AAAE in North America, or the Arterial Network for the African continent. So it was, even for Federico, who is within the region, who is based in Argentina, difficult to find potential contributors. And I have been, as I said, I've been the outsider. I have been the one who is not speaking the language, but I was the one with the funding. So there's this question, which I think is extremely important in everything we do in international context. So how to overcome power imbalances if we operate within them. So I had this idea of academic writing, which is a very Western idea of academic writing. We might talk about career paths in academia that are very different in Latin America than, for example, in Europe. I always had a European audience in mind when we read the articles, etc. And there was a constant dialogue between Federico and myself on, am I going to impose standards on my colleagues in Latin America that are Western standards? And I found that a lot of really interesting. And as I said, this entire project was a learning process that I took a lot of, not only when it comes to knowledge and research I gained, but I learned a lot about myself and how I approach things and how I collaborate. And I find that interesting. But let's go to the lessons learned. Approaching Latin America as an entity, a single entity, is in the first place a tricky thing to do. And there's always this danger of a single story. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with this TED Talk with the title "Danger of a Single Story" by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. In case you are not, I'm going to put it in the chat because it's really worth having a look at. It's about this idea of we having stereotypes, and Federico was always very keen on us avoiding that, on not conveying a special image of Latin America that might stick in the minds and open up that this is different. And we have to keep in mind this is a region that covers 20 million square meters. That is twice as large as Europe. They have very different climates, vegetation, very different political systems in place, and a huge variety of different ethnicities. And even language is not really a unifying factor. You know that Latin America was divided in the 15th century between Spain and Portugal. So most countries do speak Spanish, but Brazil, one of the biggest countries, speaks Portuguese. And then there is an enormous number of indigenous languages spoken, which are even protected as official languages in Peru and Bolivia. However, these languages have suffered a decline in recent years, and have become the basis for social and political discrimination against their speakers. So this is also something I find interesting. However, having said this, having explained the huge variety of the sector and of the country in itself, I think it doesn't come as a surprise that we have not entitled our book Latin American Cultural Management, because nothing like that exists. So we called it Cultural Management and Policy in Latin America, because you might agree with me, there is nothing like European cultural management out there. And I guess there is no African cultural management out there. So this is, yeah, maybe one lesson learned. And this is a lesson, danger of a single story. And we are it is easy to trap in there. So you see Latin America and how diverse and huge it is. Then another lesson I learned is the interdependence of arts and policy. So this is also something that popped up in many articles in our book project. So there is this struggle to develop or maintain institutions that serve the arts and culture, both within and beyond capital cities, because centralization is also an issue within the region, render artistic production accessible to diverse audiences, rather than being bodies that further enhance the power of those in government, or maybe even foreign policy interests by Spain, or to a lesser extent Portugal. Due to a certain lack of predictability and transparency in the cultural sector in a couple of countries within the region, necessary transformations have often been driven by groups that do not have their roots in politics, but in the arts. So there's this term artivism out there in English, which we, for example, in German, do not even have a translation for. But I think it is, if you want to learn how struggles for creative justice, social justice, better working conditions for those within the creative sector, building cultural infrastructure also in rural areas, equal inclusion of indigenous populations and cultures are led from bottom up, it is really worthwhile to have a look at these different organizations in Latin America. And I have to excuse my Spanish, it's horrible. Federico, please forgive me, but some prominent examples, which you see here, for example, in the middle, and that some of you might have heard of before, is the Madres and Abuela de la Plaza de Mayo, for example, or the Confederation of Workers in the Popular Economy, or a feminist movement in Argentina, the collective Ni Una Menos, just to name only a few. And I find this really interesting, and there's a lot for us in there to learn, which I can only just mention very briefly here in this presentation. And last but not least, from my side, that it is definitely not coming as a surprise that even 200 years after the independence, we have this colonial influence until the very day. Well, not even all countries within the region are independent by now, just as a footnote. But legacy is like racism that we experience, for example, in countries like Mexico and Brazil very strongly, as well as the marginalization of indigenous populations, the destruction of cultural identities or even entire cultures. All these are legacies of colonialism. And against this background, after the colonialization period, after many of these countries became independent, they were seeking for role models. And instead of looking back to century-old societies and cultures, they were sought after in, for example, Europe and particularly in France. So till the very day, you have institutions modeled after French administration in countries like, for example, Mexico, which never fitted within the region in the first place. And I find that, yeah, really, really interesting to talk about and to reflect upon. So how do institutions have to look like that really fit within the specific context? Latin America has experienced civil uprisings, guerrilla movements, dictatorships, swings to the left, interestingly known only in Europe as pink tide, because this is also a learning I took away. This is one of these terms. Pink tide is not a term currently used in Latin America, right, Federico? It's known there, but it wouldn't be used for these swings to the left, as we in Europe just use that term and think that that's common and that's a way to phrase it. It's not. And since 2010, we have seen shifts to the right, particularly, for example, in Brazil, and struggles with the economic influence that particularly the United States exercise on many countries within the region through organizations like the Monetary Fund or the World Bank. The Washington Consensus could be regarded as the most influential set of policy objectives within the region and forming neoliberal, or neoliberalism in Latin America, I would say. So it's a work of these Bretton Woods institution that has been criticized as neocolonialism by, for example, influential figures like Stiglitz, a Nobel Award winner and economist, who says, like many others, it's again this one-size-fits-all solution, and it doesn't fit within this very specific context of Latin America that's specifically complex. And the drastic impact of the so-called structural adjustment programs, particularly on rural populations, whose agricultural products were replaced by very cheap imports, has been widely documented and is till the very day important to notice, because agriculture is so huge within that region. And at the beginning of the 21st century, this led to socio-political change founded on widespread anti-neoliberal sentiment based on anti-imperialist legacies of, for example, Simón Bolívar, whom you see here, and José Martí. as well as an increasing interest in, again, indigenous concepts. And this is something that I find telling, and I think this is worth to study and discuss a bit more about, because these concepts like when we really became a kind of buzzword within the West, and there is a bit of a misunderstanding of the complexity and where it originally originates from. And it is at this point, and I know I hurried through this presentation quite a bit because of our limited time, but at this point, I'd like to hand over to Federico, who will give us a bit more background on the issues that I have just touched on, because I saw that they should be of interest to us particularly, but obviously not exclusively in the so-called West. Federico, I'm going to switch on the next slide for you, and you take us from there, please. So where's Federico?
I think we have momentarily lost Federico. I think he may have gone to switch on his microphone and...
Ah, there he is.
Very good.
I'm back. Very sorry, in the right time to leave. The right time to leave. So congratulations, Raphaela. Your Spanish is way much better than my German. We won't try that. But I was thinking when you talked about the resilience of coloniality, that even nowadays it's not only Portuguese and Spanish in our region, but it's also French. I don't know if we haven't spoke about this, but France holds its most extensive limits today with Brazil, with its presence here in South America. So that's something to be aware of. So my presentation will attempt to synthetically identify how the regional cultural landscape on which contemporary cultural management seeks to impact was configured. To this end, it becomes necessary to identify colonial intervention as the great historical breakpoint of our region. We will try to highlight some relevant elements about what the region was like before colonization, how it was transformed by it, and how certain tendencies still sustain in the symbolic structures of our region to this day. Finally, we will try to identify some distinctive elements of how cultural management assumes its insertion in this geocultural environment, and briefly identify some contemporary challenges for our profession. So, original South America, what was South America before colonial intervention? First of all, it was clearly, as Raphaela has expressed, not a unit, neither territorially, politically, nor culturally. Diversity of social experiences only partially interconnected, a combination of geographically widespread historical accumulations with unique technical and scientific developments, including the world's largest urban center at that time, Cusco, in the Andean highlands, and others scattered in the Amazonian lowlands. Two elements were common to this diversity of social experiences, and one of them is the awareness of reciprocity in intra-societal relationships and with nature, a tradition that in the mid-Andean region is associated with the figure of the Pachamama, of the Mother Earth, and the circular consumption of time. This idea that the future consists on restoring an essential order of life following traditional patterns is linked to the idea of sustaining a natural order that respects the planet as a living organism. A number of conditions facilitated the conquest of the continent by Europeans. Following the logic of reciprocity, the great civilization experiences were based in this region more on complex tributary systems than on military coercive control. The interruption of these tributary systems, together with the introduction of pathogens to which the local population lacked antibodies, and the Europeans' military technological superiority, generally oversized, made conquering success possible. So, please, the next slide, Raphaela. Okay. What was the main effects of the colonial intervention in the cultural perspective? The homogenization, identitarian homogenization of cultural diversity, under an imposed category of Indians derived from the confusion over territories that had been reached, making an historical confluence and tensions between social groups invisible. The introduction of the African enslaved element, social polarization with culture as a differentiation element between the Western elites and the popular sectors, the introduction of race, a pseudo-scientific fiction developed to organize the economic exploitation of Indians and Africans in order to maximize the economic impact of the contest. In this sense, Hamilton's calculation indicates that the silver transported to Spain in little more than a century and a half exceeded 3 times the total European reserves at the time. And this calculation does not include smuggling, which can be estimated between 10 and 50% over that figure. But the main impact was not only demographic, and the cultural transformation driven by military control was unprecedented in its depth and breadth in world history. The value systems and symbolic frameworks that determine the way communities live were replaced from top to bottom by colonial power, introducing European provincial thinking as an assumed universal. The impact of this cultural shift, with disabled specific knowledges structure based on the particular challenges of this territory and its social history, still persists. So, as Raphaela used the image of a mirror, I used another one, because this danger of a single story, and most of it, the danger that that single story is externally exposed from an economically unequal power, appears in the metaphor of this misleading mirror. We see ourselves as South Americans reflected ourselves in such powerful productions of the globalized cultural industry, with our difference again subsumed under the logic of the stereotype. And we lose in that context the possibility to foster political unity based on the recognition of our differences and our common values. So after independence, cultural capital based on the European tradition and its particular sensitive perception of the world was used to sustain the social taxonomization inherited from the colonial period. I mean, taxonomization was sustained when we got our formal political independencies. Now it was the urban native elites who assumed the top of this pyramid, influenced by English liberalism and French encyclopedism. The intention was to align national processes with the emergence of Anglo-Saxon neo-colonial powers, with England initially and the United States later. Our elites imagined our nations to be built according to the Western model and format. The primary ideological matrix was the civilizational distinction, assigning a positive value linked to modernity and the urban as a privileged space to the cusps of European origin, and synthesizing everything rural and popular under the label of barbarism. This allowed those elites to remain at the top of the local social scale. The initial idea of the revolutionary leaders aimed at confederating the subcontinent was unraveled by the partnership between local urban elites and the British imperialism. The intention was to consolidate an extractivist model now structured in the region as a supplier of commodities and as a purchaser of manufactured goods. The result was the territorial fragmentation or balkanization of a series of states following the Western nation-state model. In its interior, it tended to reproduce a configuration of cultural citizenship aimed at deepening the westernization of our territories and its populations, denying the value of indigenous and Afro-descendant traditions in the narratives of national identities. The ideological mechanics through which post-independence cultural processes sustain the scheme of interest of the nation of the colonial system has been analyzed under the focus of the notion of coloniality. This perspective assigns to cultural policies and to cultural management, as a consequence, a primary responsibility in the dismantling of this epistemicide and the reinstatement of cultural sovereignty, understood as the way of seeing a world and operating it based on one's own historically and territorially determined challenges. The next slide. How is the contemporary South American cultural context, and this is very well explained throughout our book. There is a great difference within the region in terms of the institutional and regulatory framework for culture, as well as in the robustness of the cultural industries, cultural consumptions, the advance of digitalization, and other dimensions that are determinants of the cultural ecosystem. For example, here in Argentina, we have an intellectual property law since 1933, and Chile has its own since 1970. In Uruguay, the average speed of internet connectivity is 4 times that of Venezuela or Costa Rica. Brazil had, in 2008, 98 million of Afro-descendants, Afro-Brazilians, while Bolivia had only 10 million inhabitants 4 years later. Cultural policies in general have begun to recognize popular traditions and, with them, expanded the register of subjects covered by cultural rights. But much remains to be done, and the primary mechanism is still the direct transfer of subsidies or money to artistic creators. At least since the 80s, the regional intellectual field has considered cultural policies to be an appropriate tool for strengthening incipient democracies. In the post-dictatorial period of those years, the challenge was the recomposition of the social fabric and the appropriation of public spaces. Since the 90s, the agenda shifted to the search for the very survival of the artistic and creative field in the face of the withdrawal of the state following the neoliberal imposition of an economistic approach to culture, to which Raphaela referred recently in this Washington Consensus approach. Since this century, towards democratic coexistence in the face of the emergence of governments guided by a distributive rationale that didn't manage to get over this traditional homologation between culture and the arts. At the same time, political movements based on cultural diversity have established the urgency of reforming the legitimized discourses on national identity in order to incorporate the historical accumulations and cultural singularities of indigenous and Afro-American collectives, among others. States weakened both from the right and from the left, from globalist positions, have begun to accept the need to strengthen themselves by including these historically repressed and invisibilized diversities within the framework of national identities. However, they still show little commitment to an agenda of real transformations, the allocation of resources, and the comprehensive overhaul of cultural governance structures. So nowadays, the next slide, please, Raphaela. Nowadays, the contemporary status of cultural management in our region, as is shown throughout the book that we built up with Raphaela, there is a very diverse degree of acceptance of cultural management as a professional identity. To a large extent, this is due to the recognition of this professional narrative as having been introduced with the neoliberal advance of the 90s and as a neo-colonial gesture, mainly focused on Spanish international cooperation and the universities of Barcelona and Girona, the so-called Barcelona model. In some countries, such as Argentina, Mexico, and even Brazil, with their variations, there was a process of reconfiguration of those initial mandates of cultural management introduced in the 90s, taking into account certain traditions linked to popular domestic cultures. In others, such as Bolivia and Ecuador, cultural management is largely rejected by grassroots cultural and artistic organizations, reserving the label for practices linked to institutional urban spaces or financed exclusively by private capital. The training of cultural managers in our region has expanded in the recent decades, but it still lacks an efficient integral organization, with high dropout rates largely explained by a certain lack of cultural curricular specificity. At the same time, as a reflection of coloniality, most of the programs consider mostly and even exclusively North Atlantic literature. Although professional networks, as Raphaela has explained, with the degree of maturity found in Europe, the United States, of Africa, have yet to emerge, there is a growing awareness among South American professionals of the need to come together, and in some countries, national networks are beginning to be established. There is also a growing identification of the economic impact of cultural activity, with a significant contribution to GDP in some countries, but at the same time, the sustainability of precariousness structures for artists and workers from the sector. There is an emerging discussion towards the distribution of this cultural-based income. While in a global sense increasingly aware of the colonial legacy and the way in which language consolidates global inequalities, and in which artificial intelligence facilitates translation, there is a growing but still low presence of South American colleagues in global debates. Raphaela has referred to that. And at the same time, incipient studies on the comparative cultural policies indicate that there is no such thing as a South American model of cultural policy. Raphaela has also stated that, but there is a series of common challenges nowadays based on the reduction of contemporary inequality, as well as a series of innovations in the field of cultural public policies, among which the Brazilian experience during Lula da Silva's mandate and which musician Gilberto Gil as Minister of Culture stands out. So last, and trying not to extend too much, which are, in our perspective, at least the main challenges in this cultural management contemporary agenda? Well, faced with the weakening of states, as we have already spoken, and the growing capacity of the agency of large denationalized or transnational corporations, cultural management can function as a promoter of a new contract of cultural citizenship based on the assumption of the value of cultural diversity. I think this is not strictly linked to a region, but it's a global challenge, but it expresses in a particular way in South America. The inclusion and recognition of indigenous, Afro-American, and other diversity-based traditions can help to recompose our deteriorated social contract. In this sense, greater involvement of society as a whole in the value and defense of cultural rights becomes crucial. The idea that cultural policy is exclusively concerned with the arts and that those arts are the preserve of a minority is particularly problematic in our regional democracies. We have to be attentive to the spread of the idea of buen vivir. Understanding the South American indigenous-based value system implies rethinking human ties on the basis of reciprocity, but it does not constitute a romantic proposal for a return to an idealized and inaccurate social state. Cultural management can promote spheres of social debate concerning what buen vivir means in each territory and time, but it's the communities who must answer this question. Sorry, the last one referring to that environmental, ambiental crisis that Raphaela talked about, and this to close, I'm sorry for taking a few minutes more than I should. Given the evidence of the environmental crisis, the South American cultural tradition may be calling our attention to the inefficiency of any approach that does not incorporate cultural change at its core. There is no way to address the challenges of our times through the same lenses that generated those challenges. Changes in environmental behavior patterns that are not based on the understanding that the consumption and social bonding models are the promoters of that environmental degradation will be absolutely futile. We need to reconfigure the hegemonic lifestyles and introduce the perspective of limitarism in culture. And we feel that cultural management has an enormous challenge in its promotion, and as Raphaela has expressed, we feel that the South American experience, culture and politics may give us some clues where to head. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for my English level proficiency.
Sorry, Federico, I did slip that slide by accident. I didn't want to cut you short. Sorry for that.
No problem. But you know, my fluency is weak, so any mistake, it's like, well, thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you for this invitation. It's really great to be sharing this time with you. Your fabulous.
I'm going to call back our other panelists back into the stage, as we call it. There's no fiddling about with microphones and tables in this kind of online setting, but thank you, Raphael, and thank you, Federico. I still always, when somebody says I apologize for my English or something, I think your English is so vastly better than my Spanish or my German, which is non-existent in both cases. Not least the ability to talk in these really incredibly complex topics in such a clear and candid way. So thank you very much to you both. I'm going to ask Anya and Megan and Nan, our 3 students who presented, to put on their microphones and their cameras. So we had asked the audience if they had questions to put them into the chat or into the Q&A. I don't currently see any questions, but if you have questions now, could you put them in, please? I would probably kind of kick off myself because I'm nosy and I'm curious, and I can see the intention of today was to look at influences. And at the start, I was talking about the influences without and within, and it's very interesting to hear across the 3 student presentations and also your talk just how much these 2 things, the interdependency of what happens within cultural institutions, or as you point out, cultural movements or collectives, and something that's maybe not so fully coherent as an institution, how that's influenced by much longer, older historical forces and concerns of policy and global location. I would like to kind of start with a question which is about context, because for me, what was a common thread across all of the different presentations today was how important understanding the context in which these things happen, in which cultural management takes place, matters. And I probably would like to bring in, bring a question into Nan Wang, just to ask you to talk a little bit, because your presentation was looking at Bilbao and Shanghai, and you kind of found some differences. Would you like to respond to kind of how did you understand the difficulty or the challenge of the different contexts?
Well, during my research, I found that's the most difficult part to understand maybe a concept or a series of concepts, but they have completely different meanings in different contexts. Just like cultural-led urban regeneration, maybe in the Western countries, in the Western context, it affected by neoliberalism. But in China, I found that the whole process of urban regeneration in China is very short, because the economy had achieved its success in a short period. So there is no particular period for cultural-led urban regeneration. So when I explore those concepts, I need to distinguish them into context. That's the most difficult part for me at the beginning of my research.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Kim Marie-Spence has kind of added a question into the chat, specifically about this question of context to Raphaela and Federico, and you can decide who wants to respond. And she's asking, what would be the key European cultural policy context that your work in Latin America exploded or questioned? So I think it's about how did your work kind of push back against key European ideas or concepts? Which one of you would like to respond?
I guess that one is for you, Rafaela.
I thought you would
You're more aware of European cultural policies than I am.
Oh gosh, that's a tricky one, Kim Mary. Thanks for that. Well, there are so many different layers to which I can respond. So first of all, we could talk about funding issues there. That would be a topic to talk about. For example, there is a bit of funding, EU funding, but it's very hard for projects that involve Latin America. I have experienced that a couple of times, that this is more or less prohibitive, so that you cannot really get them involved. Then there is obviously the way we treat languages. Also, when it comes to funding, there are a couple of countries out there in the world that reject to hand in, whenever they are asked to hand in something official, to do that either in English or Spanish, because it's not their language, and they want to stress that language is extremely important and that they would like to do that in their own languages. That is one argument. The second argument is that translation can be incredibly expensive, and many cannot afford. And this is, for example, also something that I experienced when doing this project, and this is something that I continuously argue for. We need more we need to build knowledge bases. And I think this is something we are not really aware of in Europe, and we consider that a one-way street, like exporting our knowledge into different parts of the world. And luckily, many of us are able to at least struggle through with English, but it's not a one-way street. So just to give you an example, I have this book, which is, as I just learned, mandatory on your curriculum, Introduction to International Arts Management, and I want it to be read in Latin America, and it needs to be translated into Spanish, and I had to raise funding for that in the first place. And secondly, I had to pay an enormous amount of money to my publishing company to allow me to let it be translated into Spanish. So there is this entire issue that is also, Maria, I might take that question way too far, but there's also this knowledge base idea. Why don't we publish more open source? Why is this still in academia so important to publish with prestigious publishing companies? So this entire project would have been maybe even better open source, because now we are facing, for example, the situation that many people in Latin America are really interested in our work, but the book costs 120 euro. That's an incredible amount of money, even for European standards, but imagine that for Latin American standards. So we exclude people from building up knowledge bases. Plus, we ourselves don't build up knowledge bases because we don't go to the hassle to translate things. So I had to translate a lot of text that I used for my research, and I used DeepL. So I have high hopes when it comes to artificial intelligence that this might be helpful one day. So Kim-Marie, I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but the entire issue of language would be something I stress here, and that it is incredibly underestimated in cultural policy, that there's not enough debate going on about it. And there is this extremely good book by a French sociologist called François Julien, which is called There's No Cultural Identity, Il n'y a pas d'identité culturelle. And he also stresses that language, he says that translation is the language of dialogue. And I think this is really cool, and we do not have that on our agenda as much as we should.
That's really interesting.
Plus two things. One of them, I try to address it in the presentation, but there is a widespread rejection of this Barcelona model, that this work in Barcelona in the 90s should fit America without any kind of translation or any aim to be translated into the social and cultural context. So this is very challenged throughout most of the chapters, or a majority of the chapters of our books, of our book, by most of the authors, of a group of the authors. And the other I would like to stress is what Raphaela started speaking about, the funding. This so-called white money comes with a group of standards, of European-based Western standards, that a vast minority of collectives and artistic movements here in South America can fit. So what it produces, and I feel it's pretty much the same in Africa, for what I heard and read, is like islands of practice, very much detached from the social fabric and exclusively linked to those Western ties, institutional ties, and that Western money that is not really committed to the contemporary discussions and debates and the making of the real, if you allow me. So I feel that is something to be questioned.
That's really interesting. I love the phrase islands of practice, and the idea of the cultural default being going in one direction only and in a monolingual sense. I'd like to bring in Megan here because in her.
Sorry, Ali,
Yes?
do you excuse me? But to be fair, I kept on thinking it's pretty much the same that the state does to grassroots movements. Much of our local, national grassroots movements are not able to get funding from the state because they don't meet those standards that are at the same time based on that Western standards.
Yeah, it's
Sorry.
almost like a bad.
Not to put all the blame in Europe, that I think that it's very unfair.
I was very taken by when Raphaela raised the artivism and some of the ideas of alternative approaches that I'd like to come back to. But first, I'd like to talk to Megan a little bit, if that's okay. Because Megan, in your presentation and dissertation, you talked about some of the challenges. It wasn't that the museum didn't know that they needed to look at these certain amount of decolonization, which as a Western European museum may seem not as obvious, but has similar challenges. You ended up looking at both the National Museum of Ireland and the National Museum of Northern Ireland as a comparator.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the differences you noted there in terms of the response to colonialism?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways in the National Museum of Ireland, it could be considered easier. They only, like in the National Museum of Northern Ireland, they have two sides of a story to appease. You know, there's obviously certain people who wouldn't see Northern Ireland as colonized, some people who do. So it's definitely the National Museum of Ireland would, in some aspects, it could be argued, have a straighter path towards the decolonization of the institution. But I did think it's quite interesting in that the National Museum of Northern Ireland, they are just slightly more aware. There was more work done on it. There was more prep going towards actually putting in place as policies towards the decolonization of the institution. And I think maybe that could be because there is two sides of the story, so there's just more awareness in general. Whereas in the National Museum of Ireland, we're independent now, so we are decolonized, even though there's still a lot of structures within the museum that indicate against that.
So a lot of parallels that the colonized systems, I think you talked about internal colonization. Yeah.
So even though all the systems, well, not all, a lot of the systems of the museum are still very much based on UK systems, because obviously it's a national museum of an independent state. It's not really seen so much as a colonial institution anymore, even though there is still quite a lot of internal colonization.
Unacknowledged or uninterrogated in some way. I think there's lots of parallels with what we were hearing in Federico and Raphaela's presentation. I'm going to turn here because there's a couple of questions that have come in the chat. I'm looking between chats and Q&As. So there, Katharina and Mags and Salome, 3 different people have got questions about the research methodologies that the students have used. So I'm going to turn this one to Anya, if that's okay, because there were a couple of questions about the experience of conducting interviews during the pandemic using online and problems of lack of physical access to the location of research. Could you tell me, because you used interviews in your presentation, could you talk a little bit about what were the issues that you encountered doing this during COVID?
So probably the major issue was actually getting interviews in the first place, because around the time I was doing interviews, they had only just started opening up the arts and cultural sector here. So there wasn't actually a lot of people didn't have the time, which was fair enough. And there was actually a lot of issues trying to get emailing institutions, because you have to go through specific emails. And if they've laid off staff, that would be a round to answer those emails. Your email's not going to get through. It has to be filtered through multiple people as well. As for the doing the interview, the online was fine. I used Teams. There's actually a transcription software which makes it a lot easier to analyze the interviews after the fact, but was harder than expected was actually building up a rapport with the person, especially as an outsider,
to the museum sector, even though we shared common interest. I think just being separated by a monitor just kind of disassociated you from the person, even though you connected on a lot of other levels. There was always just a slight disconnect because you weren't physically with the person, which was quite strange to have to mitigate and deal with.
And there was another question that Salome asked, which was actually, and that connects to something you just talked on, which is about navigating your research while being an outsider to the subject. So you weren't inside the institutions you were studying, but how do you get past some of your preconceived ideas, some of what you think is your implicit knowledges? How do you question that? How did you approach, Anya, could you respond a bit more?
How I approached that, I used specific theories in my analysis that would allow me to do that, and take me through kind of step by step how I might reflect on that process, which made it really great when actually writing the dissertation. And in terms of getting past the initial preconceptions, I think doing interviews was the key element to that, because otherwise I would have just been placing my own assumptions on this policy analysis without having ever consulted what may actually go on in museum work.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to come back to the point that was mentioned earlier about these kind of grassroots movements and alternative systems. And there's been a lot in COVID, in the pandemic. There's a lot has emerged. I'm thinking of Paola Serafini's work in, I think it's in Argentina. The looking at how artists and people working in communities, whether they were cultural practitioners, created alternative systems or used existing alternative systems. And I know that came through, it comes through in the book, you mentioned it, Federico, as well, and a disconnect between the policy and these kind of actual operation systems for culture and for the dissemination of culture. Could you comment a bit more on that, or talk a little bit more about what you think this means for the future of arts and cultural industries management?
That's for you, Federico, now.
Yes, but I will refer to you. I feel Raphaela pointed out that she needs to deconstruct some standards and some mindsets in order to get this book to be born. I feel the whole cultural governance system in a region should do that, in a region at least, should do that, because it's very much based on that homologation between culture and the arts, and not just that, but I don't know if there is a translation, but a specific group of people, that is our local aristocracy, as the cults, the cultos, the only ones that were able to hold culture and that were subjects in terms of cultural rights by the institutions. We always study that Argentina, for example, holds a cultural governance system based on the conjunction of the English Arts Council model and the French Cultural Ministry. So that is very much detached from social realities in a very diverse, in territorial and social terms, country as ours. So, but there is also a risk I would like to point out, because I feel our most high standard in regional terms was the Gilberto Gil experience and the Puntos de Cultura policy and Cultura Viva Comunitaria, that was based on the recognition of what was really happening in territorial terms, and the habilitation, I don't know if it works, for that social projects and processes to go to the cultural ministry and ask for support. The most divulged example is that indigenous communities could got to present for subsidies based on a video. They made themselves a video, and that was allowed to be a presentation asking for funding. But at the same time, that experience generated an interesting experience called Fora do Eixo, which is translated from Portuguese like out of the axis, out from the center, this center. And it turned out it was very interesting in terms of building common infrastructure, detaching from the economic focus of culture of economic focus of culture. They made like a reciprocity based money only for the network to exchange services and goods, but it turned out to be very much top-down based, very hierarchical, and very hegemonic in terms of how they express power relationships within the network. So I guess decolonization is very much harder to exercise than to speak about. And I feel that's our next, maybe our next generation of colleagues can go farther than we got to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some similar patterns that every network that gets established on principles of reciprocity, sooner or later somebody will take control of it. It's kind of the negative side of these. But Raphaela, you talked when we were discussing this event, you talked about the importance of networks and these occasions like this as ways of sharing ideas. Could you say a little bit about what you think is happening in a post-COVID world? How do we use, what are the principles of good network development to try and combat some of these problems of power?
Okay, I would like to give a more academic answer. I'm just giving, well, the answer, my brainstorming here, and I'm sharing my experiences. So when it comes to networks, and well, I have this experience with this network brokering intercultural exchange that I hope some of you are already familiar with. And my experience with COVID, and then hopefully post-COVID, is that we keep up some of the lessons learned. And I have to say that, and maybe this refers to some of the questions in the chat. So how do I do a project on Latin America without being able to go there in the first place because of COVID? So I had funding to go there, and flight was more or less already planned, and then it didn't work out, and still there is this book. And I have to say I'm not really technique savvy, and I'm happy to survive Zoom meetings and get my slides shared. But however, I think that this has been extremely useful, and I strongly hope that we carry on with these exchanges, these virtual exchanges, particularly in the international arena. So when the Network Brokering Intercultural Exchange hosted in January this year, the annual gathering, we had more participants than ever before from all different parts of the world. We would have never had those had we done that as an in-person event, which was normal before COVID. And now we have this experience, and we will never get back to doing this in person any longer for, first of all, sustainability reasons. Why does somebody have to travel for a conference of a day or two, like half the world, right? This is not sustainable in the first place, and it does work out. So we have the experience, and it works, although some people might be tired of it. But there are people that have family obligations. There are people that have funding issues, visa issues that could otherwise not attend. So to me, this has been, it sounds cynical, but let me say it like that. This had been one of the advantages of this pandemic, that we can pursue that. And really, I think I can now involve voices that would otherwise not be heard. So I'm not naive. I know, for example, that our colleagues in Cuba still have difficulties to get into Zoom meetings, for example. So we had that, for example, for the annual gathering, but there are ways around. So we got the colleague from Cuba in as well. But this is something that definitely we have to reflect on, and not everybody has stable internet. But there are definitely more opportunities to get people involved than when we just do it in person, because we assume that everybody loves to travel, everybody can travel, and everybody will travel. That's not a reality. So I personally think that this digitization that we got used to a certain extent is something that can really advance international collaboration. And it worked out. So being an outsider to the region, not going there, did not prevent us from doing this project. And I can only guess, I do not know whether it would have been a better book with me having been there. I strongly doubt it. So that worked out well. And I think just one point that I also wanted to mention is sometimes being an outsider has its advantages. So Federico and I had some constant discussions when I was saying, well, the situation in Cuba is really bad, Federico. He was saying, yeah, but Cuba is not really, doesn't stand for all of Latin America. And I was saying, yeah, I know, but I want to talk about Cuba now. And I want to talk about the freedom of speech in Venezuela and in Guatemala. And the situation is not good, Federico. And Federico feared that this might, again, be stereotypes and that everybody would say, oh, Latin America, it's all the same. If that's happening in Guatemala, it might happen anywhere else. But that is good. So me being an outsider, being able to say this, Federico, yeah, let's talk about Cuba, right? I don't want to. So this had its advantages.
I kind of liked the point you both made about reflexivity, that using different kinds of mirrors to reflect back to yourself. What is it that you are thinking and what are you hearing and what are you seeing? So I think from a student perspective, from a research perspective, it's so useful to be able to kind of learn how to question ourselves better. And we've just got a couple of minutes left, and this is something that we did very briefly last year, but does anybody on this panel have a question they want to ask another member of the panel?
I would really like to be invited to more positions of your students, because I only one question and a few minutes won't do it, but I would really love to know more about the studies you're carrying on.
Yeah, Raphaela?
Yes, I have a question when it comes to the issue of restitution, because that's a huge issue in Germany as well. And I know France just did send over tons of looted artworks, and Germany is like giving back 2 Benin bronzes. So how is that in Ireland? Are you going to give back? Is there a memorandum of understanding of giving back looted art to African countries?
Megan?
Or has something already been given back?
There's definitely ideas of wanting to give back, but the biggest problem the National Museum of Ireland have at the moment is that they don't actually know what they have. When the split from the UK happened, a lot of things just went into storage, and there was a lot of stuff that just kind of went away, like the leftover parts of British imperialism were put away and they didn't want to be thought about. So when I was speaking to some members of staff from the National Museum of Ireland, they were saying that some of the work that needs to be done before that can even happen is real top priority at the moment, actually finding out what they have, where it came from, in order to understand who to give it back to. Because if they don't know that much, then that's, yeah.
Federico put a question in the chat saying why only to our African brothers, but actually there has been a very famous case in Ireland, not in the National Museum, but is the return of Aboriginal remains, which has been a huge topic about the restitution of, similar to some of the issues in the US. But it's quite an it's a live topic because Ireland is reconciling itself to its own colonial state. So part of the question is how do the colonized or possibly colonized see themselves in repatriation from their own institutions? So there's a double layer of complexity that Megan was exploring. So Kim in the chat is saying that the Irish situation speaks to the importance of public attention and purpose. And yes, clearly the conversation has been heightened by the Black Lives Matter movement last year, the resurgence of it, that this is suddenly is gaining more. It wasn't that nobody was having the discussions, it's that they have become more urgent, and people are communicating and networking digitally in a way that they didn't do before. We're at 2:30, and we had said we would finish up. So I'm very conscious of the amount of time we've given and the time of day. It's now, for Nan, it's now 10:30 at night. We were really impressed that she's, and Federico's already had a very early start this morning. We're spanning the globe, about 20 hours between us. I'd just like to thank again all of our panelists today: Anya Wills, Megan Kelly, Nan Wang, Raphaela Henze, Federico Escribal. We will have a further seminar series, the final seminar of our subject area this semester is next week on the 24th of November. We will have Tess Slominski. The event is open to anybody to join. Raphaela and Federico, you're very welcome to join us as well. And Tess Slominski will be talking about her book, Trad Nation, Gender, Ethnicity in Irish Traditional Music. It promises to be very, very exciting. I'd like to thank you all and to say the recording of this will be made available online. We will have these short videos that the students produced also available through a YouTube link shortly. And thank you very much. And thank you to all our audience for joining and engaging in the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali, for having us. Thank you.